Whoa. Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a tabletop game designer, a lover of history, and a lifelong player of Age of Empires 2. And on this series, Theorycrafting, I take civilizations not yet present in Age of Empires 2 and take a crack at designing them and seeing how they might be implemented in the game if they were to be introduced. On this episode, we have a bit of an unusual one that I am told has been rather controversial and hotly debated in the Age of Empires theory crafting scene, and of course, I could not embark on such a treacherous journey alone. I had the help of the fantastic commenter and viewer Simbelmynë, who knows a lot more about this particular civilization than I ever did before going into this. He was massive in the construction of this civilization, and I thank him deeply for all of his help. But without further ado, it's time that we get started on the Polynesians.
Hey!
Yes, indeed, the Polynesians, the first of potentially a couple Oceanian civilizations that could be hypothetically added to the game. Before we get started, if you want to see any of my normal disclaimers on how I go about this process, if you want to know my philosophy as a game designer, please take a look on the screen now. And as always, if you want to see all of the details on this civilization, including a full tech tree image, take a look at the civilization document down in the description. It also includes all of my sources, as well as a couple of useful supplemental materials that Simbelmynë put together. And with all that being said, let's get started with the Polynesians. But before we do, a bit of a preamble to tackle. Namely, do the Polynesians merit inclusion in Age of Empires? This was the first question that I asked Simbelmynë. I was fascinated by the idea, but I really didn't know if they would fit. There are a whole lot of civilizations out there in the world that I don't think merit inclusion. But as Simbelmynë and I discussed the Polynesians, I learned a lot about them that made them far more realistic as candidates than I could have imagined before learning about them. Let's go through a couple of the points that we tackled together. First of all, some pros. The time frame. The Polynesians were at their height in the 1200s AD, right smack in the middle of the AoE2 relevant time frame. Second of all, the Polynesians had a very large empire at a number of different points. Not only did they have a very large territory, but they also had a surprisingly large population, constant trade and tribute, organized nations with various castes and laws. It was a sophisticated society on par with many other civilizations currently represented in the game. So that's another tick box in favor of the Polynesians. A third were their armaments. Be honest with me here. How much do you know about Polynesian weapons? Did they make swords? Did they use bows? Did they have siege weapons? Well, the answer to all of those is kinda, yeah, actually. They had a very large variety of sophisticated weapons and armor. And though they never used metal in creating them, a lot of these were very deadly, thanks to use of sea creature bits, as we'll get into a little bit later in the build. And the last pro is that the Polynesians actually built castles and pretty extensive fortification networks. Now, this might be kind of a weird thing to judge civilizations based off of, but since we are playing Age of Empires 2, a big focus of the game is castles, castle age, and the like, it seems important to me that fortification networks were a big part of a given civilization, even though I did remove castles from my Swiss build, but we're not talking about that right now. But let's also touch upon the cons of including the Polynesians in the game. What makes them not perfect contenders? Well, the first and foremost of these is that they didn't have metalworking, and many other tech limitations as well. People often talk about the Aztecs as being a Stone Age society, which is actually completely untrue. They did have metalworking. They only, however, were limited to copper, and therefore mostly used it in tools rather than weapons. Not to mention devising things like writing and mathematics in very extensive and sophisticated manners. Now, the Polynesians didn't lack all of these things, especially things like math and written language. We just don't know whether it was as thorough and extensive as many Mesoamerican cultures, and if it was, it just wasn't preserved particularly well. So the Polynesians would be distinctly the bottommost civilization in the game in terms of their real-life technological development. Now, the other big con is that the Polynesians had very minimal contact with other civilizations in-game during the AoE2 relevant time frame. There were arguably 2 or 3, and even those are big stretches. And when I was discussing with Simbelmynë, he indicated that this was the single best argument against adding the Polynesians. But I think that since we have 4 pretty strong pros and 2 pretty strong cons, I personally tend towards believing that they do deserve to be included. And I'd love to know, what do you think? Regardless of how you end up liking the build, whether you fall on one side or another, I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts on whether you think the Polynesians could have a possible place in the game. But with our preamble out of the way, let's move on to the history. The history of Polynesia during the AoE2 relevant time frame. So before anything else, please know, history on this subject is very, very sparse. Almost all the sources we have come from oral traditions from these various islands. Those obviously can be wrong, but also will oftentimes use metaphor to represent real-life events, which makes them a little bit tough to interpret for direct, tangible history. So let's get into it. Polynesia was colonized possibly earlier than you might have expected. It was first settled in 800 BC. Wow! And after some of the major Polynesian islands like Tonga and Samoa were colonized, the Polynesian peoples then spread out in every direction across the Pacific, making settlements on pretty much every single habitable island, with the very last one being, kind of surprisingly, New Zealand in 1200 AD. And so the Polynesian peoples were crossing the Great Waters for 2,000 years before they found all the settleable land in the region, but that didn't stop them from making a great many imperial efforts during this time. To better illustrate what I mean when I say Polynesia, here's a good map representation of it. It's this kind of oblong parallelogram type shape, and is distinct from the further west Melanesia and Micronesia, as well as, of course, Australia and Papua New Guinea. So a pretty substantial amount of space, colonized over again about 2,000 years. The first empire to ever surface within Polynesia was based in Samoa. It was kind of a loose confederacy called the Samoan Manu'a. And it was roughly a bunch of chiefdoms that agreed to kind of collaborate, as well as pay tribute to a kind of centralized chiefdom. Or at least that's the best we know. Unfortunately, the Manu'a is not very well preserved, and we know almost nothing about it. But we do know that it was in power for probably a couple hundred years before 900 AD, and that it held a pretty substantial amount of land, though we have no idea of what the actual boundaries of its empire was. But it did leave a pretty substantial legacy, one that was inherited later by the most famous Polynesian empire, the Ui-te-Rangiora. This was based in the island of Tonga, as you might expect, and took control in around 950 AD, though the groundwork for it was laid substantially beforehand, and it wouldn't reach its height as an empire until a couple hundred years later. Over the centuries, the Ui-te-Rangiora would take control of a number of islands, steadily increasing their influence and demanding tribute from the great many chieftainships that they conquered, until in 1200 AD they hit their peak. The bounds of their empire and their influence was vast. You see those 2 islands I have highlighted there? That's several thousand miles of space in between them. And the Ui-te-Rangiora ruled effectively a large oval whose farthest points were those 2 islands. A truly vast undertaking. And so while they were ruling from the Melanesian island of Pohnpei to the far eastern Polynesian island of Tahiti, this rule was not without issue. There were a great many assassination attempts on Tongan royalty, and the empire started to break down in the 1300s AD, though it would take several hundred years before it properly collapsed. Though even though this empire collapsed, that did not mean that Tonga itself collapsed, and the royal title of Ui-te-Rangiora continued for many hundreds of years, and I think might actually still be active to this very day. Now, in the 1500s, something else pretty important happened, namely European contact. I don't know the exact specifics of who contacted the Polynesians first, but by 1600, I'm pretty sure a number of European powers had made contact, at least adjacently, through their more extensive trading in the western extremities of Australasia. That being said, it would take until well into the 1700s AD for Polynesia to be more properly brought into contact with Europe, at which point it was eventually parceled out, colonized, and conquered. Though, as you may know, New Zealand held out for quite some time, with the Maori holding out far longer than many other indigenous peoples ever did during the ages of imperialism. But that isn't the end of Polynesian contact with other cultures. There is some evidence, and I do emphasize some evidence, of them being in contact with the Incas in around the 1400s AD. An Incan king led a great naval expedition out from his land, well documented for his time period, and returned with news of strangers on nearby islands. And similarly, there are Polynesian legends that seem to be from around that same period of strange invaders from a distant land showing up on Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, the furthest east extremity of Polynesian domain. Now, it seems like there might have been a war if this is what actually happened, and there is some evidence, possibly genetic, possibly based in sweet potato distribution. There are a bunch of different theories, and none of it is confirmed. But it is hypothetically another way in which the Polynesian peoples made contact with other civilizations, and therefore should definitely be represented in campaigns, as we will get to later. So amidst all of that history, as vague and uncertain as some of it is, where are the Polynesians now? Well, these days the Pacific Islands are a mix of independent states and protectorates, though almost all of them retain very strong cultural roots to their Polynesian heritage. One of the reasons we know anything about this time period is how well oral traditions were passed on well into the age of imperialism, and some were documented to the extent that they could be recorded, enjoyed, and turned into Age of Empires civilizations by us lucky folk living in the 2020s. History behind us, let us proceed to the flavor of this particular Polynesian civilization build. Beginning with the architecture, they would have a new architecture palette, that being Oceanian. Now, Simbelmynë has put together a presentation of different Oceanian architectures that could be used as influence for how they could look in Age of Empires. I'd highly recommend you take a look at it, linked down in the description as well as on the civilization document. But suffice for now to say that the Oceanian architecture would look very, very distinct, but falls somewhere between Southeast Asian and Mesoamerican, if I had to classify it. Once again, see the document below for examples, including links to all sources that Simbelmynë used. The language spoken by the Polynesians would be Tongan, Malo Elele, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, there were many languages spoke all across Polynesia, but since the Tui Tonga were the most famous of all Polynesian empires, only made sense that we would pick them as the main focus, and their wonder would be the Ha'amonga a Maui. This is a very famous and very large trilithon construction. This picture doesn't really do justice to just how big it is, but you could probably stack 3 or 4 people on top of each other and they wouldn't get to the top of that thing. Even so, you might need to scale up this particular construction to match the scale of other Age of Empires wonders. Let's move on to some campaigns. The Polynesians, as we have seen in many other instances, are a bit unusual here because many of their great leaders aren't super well documented. A couple are okay, but both of my ideas for how to approach a Polynesian campaign ended up being melanges of a couple of different protagonists with a shifting narrative lens, beginning with the Pacific Pioneers campaign. This would follow various Polynesian journeys of discovery across the Pacific, including their few contact points with other civilizations. This could start with, for example, their discovery and settlement of the island of Hawaii. This was led by an explorer only remembered by the name Mo'ikea. Similarly, we could follow them to New Zealand, the last of their major colonization efforts, led by an explorer only remembered as Kupe. Easter Island, though it came before New Zealand, could follow the navigator Hotu Matu'a, but later in the scenario would skip ahead a couple hundred years to allow you to play out a major island defense against that hypothetical Incan invasion I mentioned earlier. Another scenario could then focus on the hypothesized Polynesian discovery of Antarctica. The evidence, again, for this comes from oral tradition, but would follow the explorer Ui-te-Rangiora, as he found himself in a strange land where great stones of arrowroot powder grew out of the water itself, and your main enemies would be the elements rather than other peoples. Lastly, the Pacific Pioneers campaign could end with a hypothetical European first contact scenario where a number of desperate sailors shipwreck on a Polynesian island and you need to do your best to negotiate with them or fight them off before they can wipe you all out. So it would be very much a grab bag, this campaign, but I think it could touch upon the highlights of Polynesian history pretty effectively, though if a more conventional campaign was preferred, we do have another option available for you here, that being the rise of the Tui Tonga nation. This would follow 3 different protagonists. First, the progenitor of the Tongan Empire, a man named AoE2, who is thought to be largely mythological, but probably was a real person whose deeds were just mythologized later on. It would then skip a couple generations ahead to a man named Momo, who was the founder of the Tui Tonga, and then skip ahead to his later descendant, Tui-Tatui, who led the nation into its golden era and broadened its borders to their greatest extent. The downside of this Tu'i Tonga campaign was that you would pretty much only be fighting other Polynesian civilizations. But the upside would be that it has a pretty compelling narrative arc and could be a pretty accurate representation of Polynesia at its zenith during the AoE2 relevant timeframe. As for other possible campaigns and Polynesian appearances in current campaigns, well, the answer to that would be a big fat 0 in both counts. It was hard as is coming up with these two campaigns, but that is to be expected for the civilization tied with the Incas as the single most isolated one the game currently knows. And I hope you find them relatively compelling and interesting nonetheless. Let's move on to the major themes that Simbelmynë and I identified while looking through Polynesian history. Unfortunately, these ones are pretty simple. First one, the ocean. Wouldn't you know it, the Pacific is big, and the Polynesians were masters of long-distance travel, trade, and exploration. Many people know about the famous stick charts that were used to track trade winds and currents across the Pacific Ocean that would allow the Polynesians to sail to distant islands with pinpoint accuracy. But it wasn't just islands they already knew about. These guys were so good at sailing that they found islands it would take the rest of the world hundreds upon hundreds of years to happen across, leaving their metaphorical footprint on the moon before anyone else was even considering building a rocket ship. They also had incredibly efficient naval combat, with many fast warships and amphibious raiding parties of soldiers who would jump out of their canoes and blitz enemy camps. This lent itself to an overall style of warfare in Polynesia that was very focused on mobility and pillaging, taking what you can and getting away before your enemy has time to close the distance. They tended to avoid pitched battles, though these were still very much a thing and did happen on quite a few occasions, even in recorded Polynesian history. Now, another major theme I identified was alternative armaments. The fact that these people made so many interesting tools and weapons and armor even out of materials besides metal. They made use of sea creatures, shells, plant husks, and wood, even creating full-body suits of plate mail on certain occasions, and wielding everything from long pikes to short swords made out of shark teeth. Many of these weapons were also incorporated into ceremony and even sport. Ceremonial clubs, for example, were a major symbol of Polynesian rulership, and a number of the weapons that they crafted were turned into enduring athletic traditions that survive even today. Lastly, the Polynesians were very strategically diverse in how they approached warfare. Not only did they use a lot of unarmed combat and grappling to supplement their primary armaments, but they also made a lot of use of fire, delivering fire at, in some cases, very substantial distances to torch enemy buildings while on the water themselves, so they had quite a few options available to them in the field of battle. Last theme that we found was abundance. They had massive fishing and farming economies considering their tech level and the amount of actual land space they had to plant things on. Coconut farming was obviously huge in the area, and one of the major reasons for their abundance and success is they had some of the earliest practices surrounding the conservation of resources that is known to humankind. In particular, the religious practice of tapu, which we will touch upon later. But with these themes now fresh in our minds, we come to the end of the history section. If this is all you were here for, thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe before you go. And for all those of you who, like me, love Age of Empires and want to see what Simbelmynë and I have done with the civilization, let's move on to game mechanics. Beginning with some necessary updates. As you might imagine, the Polynesians won't be able to rely on a standard tech tree, and as such, they draw from a number of different regional pools that I plan on incorporating into other civilization builds going forward, starting with Andean regional units, specifically the Long Pikemen. Obviously, we have this represented in the game right now as the Kamayuk, but it turns out that many other civilizations besides the Incans made use of long pikes. Not only other major civilizations in South America, of which there were quite a few, but also the Polynesians, who have been reported to use pikes as long as 18 feet, covered in shark teeth to inflict vicious cutting wounds on enemies at a great distance. Now, my current build of the Long Pikeman is very similar to the current Kamayuk, though a little bit weaker overall. The Polynesians would not have access to the fabric shields technology, making it so that this unit was substantially weaker when fully upgraded. The other major change that I have made is that their cost is now changed to 30 food, 30 wood, 30 gold, forcing you to have a more rounded economy if you want to tech into them, but allowing them to serve for civilizations like the Polynesians, who, as we'll get into later, really lack for power units, as a mighty backbone to their late-game infantry armies. Now, of course, this would mean that the Incas would need a new castle unique unit, and I have quite a few ideas for those. I'm not sure if I want to get into them here or in a future redesign for the Incas, but suffice for now to say that the 2 routes I think you could go would either be some sort of heavy maceman or a fast-moving chasqui courier. Now, in addition to the long pikemen, the Polynesians would have access to another Mesoamerican regional unit, that being the slinger. I went into this in my Zapotex build, though following a little bit of feedback, I have updated them slightly since then. More details on that in my upcoming recraft video, but suffice for now to say, if you haven't seen that video already, that the slinger would be a trash unit, kind of like a skirm, but they'd have better damage and speed, crappy armor, and overall worse accuracy. They'd have a very small attack bonus versus infantry, much less than they do now, but they would also have a minimum damage of 2, 3 when upgraded, meaning no matter how well armored an enemy is, you're going to be doing some damage with a slinger. This will make them much more effective at taking down strong enemies when massed up, and will play pretty nicely with their infantry bonus damage as well. They cost 60 food. This is the main change I made from my first build. They originally cost 40. It was pointed out to me that that was ridiculous, and so now their food cost has been increased to be equivalent to that of a skirmisher if you ported all the wood to food. So between these 2 regional units, you can see the Polynesians having a fairly unconventional tech tree already, but as we'll get into shortly, it gets much, much weirder than that. Let's go to an overview of the civilization. The Polynesians, a navy and economy civilization, starting with their civilization bonuses. Polynesians will always start near to a small lagoon containing 3 shorefish. This would be like, 20 tiles large lake at maximum. It would have to be coded such that it can't clip into other important resources, but it could be conjoined with other major bodies of water. Obviously, the Polynesians were incredibly connected to the ocean, and since so much of their economy focused around fish, it just seemed ridiculous to me that in today's age of predominantly all land maps, they would lose access to like half of their benefits just because of map generation. And so this is a way of making sure they always have a little bit of water they can work with going into the game. Second bonus, they can build the weir starting in feudal age. The weir is a building that works kind of like a dock crossed with a farm. It must be placed touching the coastline, though unlike a dock which has to be going out onto the water, the weir has to be going onto land. Weirs are quite expensive and very vulnerable, and when you first create them, you can't harvest anything from them. Instead, over time, they will quickly fill with fish, which you can then task a villager to, who will harvest it as though it were shorefish, allowing for a very high gather rate. Once the weir is depleted, it will steadily start to increase again. Notably, it will not regain resources while it is being gathered from. So obviously, the weir is a perfect building to build on your starting lagoon, giving you a hypothetically unlimited supply of food going into late game, though forcing you to micro your economy such that you can maximize the efficiency of it refilling and then being gathered from. Third bonus, lumberjacks grant you food as they cut wood. Now this is in reference to coconut farming, and it is yet another, the third major economy bonus this civilization has. I can obviously imagine this being extremely strong, but as you'll see later, the Polynesians really need to rely on their powerful economy to pull a lot of weight for them, especially going into late game. Fourth bonus, military units take less damage from buildings, which scales per age. This is in reference to the fact, as mentioned earlier, that most Polynesian warfare consisted of these lightning-fast raids. Note that this bonus would not allow you to take 0 damage from a building, so it would always be capped at 1. And especially in the case of high-damage buildings like castle versus low pierce armor units, you're still going to get chewed apart pretty quickly despite this bonus. Note that it does also apply to ships, by the way, though since buildings do so much bonus damage to ships, it's not going to help out nearly as much as with land units. Fifth bonus. Unique infantry upgrades are available at the blacksmith in Imperial Age. I'll get into these a little bit more later on, but suffice it to say that blast furnace and plate mail armor have both been replaced by similar technologies that have slightly different utility. They're more side grades than strict upgrades, though overall I think that they are going to be a benefit in most cases. And lastly, the team bonus. All coastlines on the map are revealed from the start of the game. This would work much like the Vietnamese bonus, where town centers are revealed, and as such, it wouldn't mean that the fog of war vanishes. You would just, on your minimap, have a jagged outline of where every single beach tile in the entire game is, which, of course, will really help with early game rushes, figuring out where to place your docks, and things like that. This bonus is obviously in reference to the fact that the Polynesians were unparalleled navigators and knew a lot about the Pacific well before pretty much any other civilization knew that the Pacific even existed. Let's move on to their unique units, starting with their castle unique unit, the Polynesians. This is a fast raiding infantry costing 35 food, 35 gold. It's very fast, it has a bit low HP, and its attack isn't fantastic either. However, it gets a very nice attack bonus versus both buildings and siege weapons. And since it has a fast rate of fire, its fairly lowish attack, plus this bonus can allow it to absolutely chew through things like town centers and castles. It also has a dodge shield, pretty much identical to the Simbelmynë, but projectile only, just like that unit. And it is able to swim. You can task the Polynesians to enter water, at which point it will enter a swimming animation, retain its dodge shield, and have lower movement speed. Additionally, a little meter will display above the unit as it is swimming, and once this meter hits 0, it will start to lose HP unless you can get it back to land. The deeper the water, the faster the meter runs down, and the more damage it will then take. This also applies if the Polynesians is on a transport ship that is sunk. It will immediately start swimming, giving you a chance to get them over to land and to safety. Note that the unit cannot, however, attack while it is in the water. So a very interesting unit, right? Very versatile, a lot of stuff it can do, but not a lot of raw power. It has one other thing going for it, though, and that is that it replaces your starting scout. The Polynesians do not have Eagle Warriors, Eagle Scouts, or Cavalry, and as such, you're going to start the game with a Polynesian. The upside of the Polynesian is that it does retain its dodge shield in early game, meaning that you might be able to do some cheeky stuff avoiding town center fire or maybe juking an enemy tower. It can also still swim, giving you a lot more ability to scout out the map with this unit. The downside is that the Polynesians will not stand up very well to other scout units in one-on-one fights, meaning that you definitely have to be a little more careful with it and maybe strategically hide it in water when you can. That's quite a unit, right? Very, very impactful. Let's talk about a possibly even more impactful one, the Fire Dart Thrower. This would be a special archer available at the castle for 70 wood and 70 gold. And wouldn't you know it, it replaces the trebuchet. And it's available in Castle Age. Oh my goodness, this is going to absolutely break the game. Obviously, it's a lot weaker than the trebuchet, but it does have similar range, and it does have a very nice bonus damage against buildings. Has a higher rate of fire, lower damage overall, and with its much lower cost, will still be quite impactful while being far more mobile. The Fire Dart Thrower does count as an archer, and therefore benefits from all archer technologies. If you do prioritize getting archer range upgrades, it will always outrange normal castles, not including things like the Teutons, while also having a nice attack bonus versus ships. Now, what the heck is this unit even? Well, it turns out that all across Polynesia, there was a special throwing stick, not an atlatl, but kind of similar process, connected to a rope, connected to a javelin that you would kind of stake in the ground, and you would use tension combined with a big warm-up throw to hawk this javelin just an utterly massive distance. Obviously, sources are not always reliable here, but there are some that say you could get multiple hundreds of yards with one of these throws, and that these javelins were often set on fire, used to torch distant villages and nail enemy ships. It was one of the main ways the Polynesians delivered fire over a pretty substantial distance. As such, it felt like a very elegant way of giving them a useful siege option that removed the very frustrating trebuchet from their roster. I know it's necessary, I know it's a convention, but man, I really hate how many civilizations need to get the trebuchet. And when you have something like this that has kind of a similar niche, well, my historicity senses start tingling. And so here's the attempt to give the Polynesians something besides the trebuchet that they can use to besiege things from a distance, while also definitely being a side grade. Like, available in Castle Age, great. Higher mobility, great. Much cheaper, great. But much, much worse damage. And you have to upgrade it in Imperial Age for a good amount of resources if you want to improve that damage output to anywhere close to a trebuchet. Which, again, even if you have 3 of these things fully upgraded, they still do less damage than a normal treb. So a side grade overall, but the fun doesn't stop there. The Polynesians have yet another unique unit, the Catamaran. This would be a unique ship built at the dock for 60 wood, 10 gold. Very, very cheap. It is a melee ship, very, very quick, but with a fairly weak attack. It has an ability, however, where whenever it deals a melee attack to an enemy, it will pin that enemy in place just for a couple seconds. This allows you to use your catamarans to zoom up to enemy navies, stick them in place, and allow the rest of your guys to catch up and pick off the ones that were held down. They also have a transport mechanic. They can hold many fewer units than a transport ship and don't benefit from technologies like careening and dry dock expanding transportation space, but while they are holding units, they gain a small boost to their rate of fire. Though their attack is quite weak, remember they do melee damage, and ships don't normally have melee armor. So between that and their rate of fire bonus, catamarans can actually pull off a decent amount of damage if you crew them, which of course is risky since they don't have a lot of HP. With Powhatan, however, even if this ship sinks, you can still probably get your soldiers to another ship safely. I think I forgot to mention, the catamaran is available from Feudal Age, and it can be upgraded to a War Catamaran in Castle Age and to the Drua in Imperial Age, both for costs slightly less but comparable to things like the galley line. With all those unique units out of the way, let's move on to unique technologies, starting with the unique blacksmith technologies from their civilization bonus. Replacing Blast Furnace is Shark-Tooth Blades. This, instead of giving you bonus attack power, will allow all infantry, and cavalry if you can get them, to inflict a bleeding effect on enemies, dealing a guaranteed 3 extra damage over 5 seconds. This ignores armor and does stack, meaning that Polynesian infantry can really rack up the damage if you can get a lot of them attacking at once, but it's slow. You need to wait 5 seconds to get that damage, and in that time a lot can happen. And as such, they don't have nearly as much power, but they have a little bit more utility. Additionally, Shark-Tooth Blades cost wood instead of gold, making it just a little bit easier to tech into. Similarly, plate mail armor is replaced by the unique technology Pufferfish Helmets. Just like Shark-Tooth Blades, this costs wood instead of gold, and it gives 1 less pierce armor than normal, but causes any melee attacker who strikes a Polynesian infantryman to take a guaranteed 2 damage in return as soon as they land the blow. Once again, it is a side grade. It makes Polynesian infantrymen a lot more susceptible to archers, though buildings will of course still have trouble due to their civilization bonus, but will make them that much more annoying for enemy cavalry and infantry to get rid of. So overall, I think both of these technologies will be improvements, especially in things like Trash Wars, where grindy attrition gameplay is the norm. But in faster paced scenarios, these technologies are probably going to be more of a hindrance than a help, which I think is a pretty good trade-off overall, since, as we will get into, the Polynesians really like the rating playstyle and definitely need the help in attrition scenarios. On to their more standard castle unique technologies. First of all, Tapu. This technology, available in Castle Age, makes it so that all resources within the line of sight of monasteries slowly replenish while not being gathered from. This replenishment is much slower than a weir and does stack with a weir if weirs are within a monastery's line of sight, and of course only applies if a resource node has not been depleted. As soon as that tree turns into a stump, Tapu no longer applies to it. Now what this means is if you can micro your economy properly as the Polynesians, you have unlimited resources. But will that ever happen realistically? Probably not. Instead, it will be a marginal bonus that will help you, for example, draw out a stone or a gold pile a little bit longer, or make your weirs more efficient. But if you're really going to sacrifice villager work time in order to make it so that nothing ever runs out, you are probably losing the game despite this bonus. Imperial Age technology, on the other hand, is Kailao. This is a Tongan war dance, similar to the Hawaiian hula and the Maori haka, and this technology makes it so that all melee units, including the catamaran and siege ram, by the way, will build up boosts to their attack and speed while they are stationary, completely unmoving. Once they start moving, these bonuses will wear off very quickly, but will allow you these massive bursts of speed and power if you can time them properly. Kailao also allows your unique Powhatan unit to be trainable from the barracks. This is a great raiding technology and allows you absolutely massive speed if you use positioning and timing intelligently. Of note, infantry that are garrisoned in ships or rams count as unmoving for these bonuses, making it so that if you can load up a catamaran or something like that with Powhatan, those boys are going to be sprinting as soon as they disembark. And with that, we've finally come to the end of the civilization overview. Wow, I think that was the longest one I've ever done. Make sure to check out the civilization doc in the description if you want any details on any of these elements of the civilization and more. Let's move on to the tech tree. Spirit of the Law style. Let's do some grades, ladies and gentlemen, starting with their infantry. It's an A. They have the Powhatan. They have the regional Imperial Long strong pikemen, which if you've played with comics, you know that those can be terrifying if you get them into a death ball. They have the Kailau unique technology, and they have their unique blacksmith upgrades. So many benefits, and a perfect tech tree, if you assume that shark-tooth blades and pufferfish helms aren't a downgrade. Also, the reduced damage from buildings is, in my opinion, especially helpful for infantrymen, because it will mean that when you run 20 Polynesians into the enemy's base late game, you don't have to worry about one castle absolutely ruining your day. So overall, infantry are your absolute military backbone as the Polynesians, and if you aren't making them, you are probably doing something wrong. Moving on to archers. It's a B+. They have the unique fire dart thrower. That is an archer, even though it acts more like a siege unit. They also have the elite slinger available from the archery range, but they lack Arbalester, and they lack Thumb Ring, meaning that while their Castle Age crossbows are playable, they aren't very good. I mentioned earlier the Polynesians really want power units, and this is one of the many examples of that in practice. I guess that their archers do also benefit from taking reduced damage from buildings, but for the most part, that's not how you will be using the units. And so take this B+ with a big grain of salt. Their archers don't really play like other civilizations' archers, and are more support units rather than damage dealers. Siege. It's a C-. You could call the fire dart thrower a siege unit, but I personally don't. They do have siege ram, but they have nothing else. Stuck with mangonels. They do have Kailau, which does benefit their siege rams, but overall, if you're playing siege as the Polynesians, it is solely to make use of siege rams once you have Kailau research, which is admittedly a pretty good combo, but still not having onagers does hurt. So I think a C- is fair overall. Defenses. It's a D. I mentioned earlier that the Polynesians did build walled forts and things, but their walls weren't particularly big or prominent. And as such, they lack fortified walls as well as a ton of useful defensive upgrades. Their university is very sparse overall. And so even if a lot of these upgrades aren't stuff you would normally need to get in-game, that's more to do with the metagame not rewarding defensive playstyles than with the Polynesians actually having a good defensive tech tree. So a D for defenses. D for defenses. Economy, A+. Arguably one of the best in the game. They have the Weir, infinite food. They have Tapu, infinite everything. They have 2 very good economy bonuses, but they miss a ton of technologies. They don't even have Heavy Plow, the one civilization in the game to not get them. They also lack 2-man saw and both advanced mining upgrades. So how are they good when they have all of these missing technologies? Well, they have 3 free shorefish guaranteed every game, as well as a ton of food coming off of their woodcutting bonuses, as well as the Weir and Tapu. So yes, they're missing a lot, but they have so much going for them that it's gotta be an A+. You don't get 3 shorefish free at the start of every game without it being an A+ economy. And now moving on to a new part of this tech tree subsection, commenter Eric DW mentioned that Spirit of the Law had recently started talking about trash units in his grades. And so for me, that means we get to talk about levies, my term for trash. So for the Polynesians, I'm giving them a B+ for their levies. Not only are shark-tooth blades and pufferfish helmets especially useful in trash wars where your halberdiers are mostly going to be sacrificial, but they have perfect upgrades for their elite skirmishers and halberdiers, except for Thumb Ring on their skirmishers, and they have access to the very useful elite slinger. Couple that with their massive economy, which will be especially helpful in trash wars due to the focus on wood and food, and you have a very good civilization for late-game trash battles if they can get there. Onto the dock. It's an A. The Polynesians have a great dock. They have the Catamaran. Their Po Vital unique unit is great on water maps. They have access to shipwright, and while they do lack Cannon Galleon and the Demolition Ship, their coastline reveal bonus will make it so that they can get off to every water game with an absolute bang. Even though they don't have a ton of explicit water bonuses, they have a lot of tangential water bonuses. Their economy bonuses are often focused around water, like the Weir is great on water maps, and the fact that their economy is so attrition resistant is very, very good on maps like Islands, where running out of resources is a much, much bigger deal. So overall, I give their dock an A. And for monks, it's a B. Tapu will incentivize you to build a bunch of monasteries, and the only technology they lack is block printing, which does kind of hurt and makes it so that siege onagers are still very dangerous, but overall, their monks are very usable, especially a little bit earlier in the game, so I think a B is a fair grade for them overall. That's tech tree done. Let's look at the playstyle. How do I think this Polynesian build would actually play in-game. Starting with their early game, you have a monstrous eco. And when you have a very good eco in Age of Empires, that means you have a good early military. You have some great rush options, militia into man-at-arms, using your Povai-Tau starting scout to help chop through house walls and things like that. You can also play archers, though your archers are pretty crap once you hit Castle Age. And on water maps, getting out cheap catamarans early on to scout the map and pin down enemy ships is going to be really, really useful. You also have a very good boom. Your eco just gets better as the game keeps going, so you're not locked into playing a rush as the Polynesians, even though your rushes are very good. So suffice to say, as the Polynesians, your early game is great. You have tons of options and a lot of speed. Mid-game sees the Polynesians get a lot of new power available to them. They have a bunch of different power spikes as they hit certain technologies and units, like being able to make Povai-Tau and raid enemy town centers, or being able to make fire dart throwers to treb down castles before you hit Imperial Age. These things are all extremely useful, and once you hit early Imperial Age, Kai Lao will completely transform how you use infantry and catamarans on water. Now, that being said, in mid-game, you will start to feel the lack of power units. The only one you really have is the Long Pike, because while champions will be pretty useful with Kai Lao, they are not the sort of unit you want to rely on in this Arbalester-centric world. And so since you don't have Arbs, you don't have siege onagers, and you obviously don't have any cavalry, you're going to have to start playing very smart as the Polynesians so that you don't just get completely outgunned by your opponents at this point in the game. Your economy also starts to transition from speed to endurance. You have all of those amazing eco bonuses early on that really jump you into the front running before Castle Age, but once you hit Castle Age, you're going to start to want to build weirs and research tapu in order to draw out the resources you have available to you, because that's what your economy is going to be really, really good at in post-Imperial. But come late game, infantry spam will be your bread and butter. You have a great death ball, your Imperial long pikes are amazing, and your champions and halberdiers will be fully upgraded and with access to shark tooth blades and pufferfish helmets. But infantry spam is not usually a good way to win games, especially when you don't have the Goth technology perfusion on your side. And so instead, as the Polynesians, you're often going to want to use lightning raids to supplement your infantry frontline. With Povai-Tau, fire dart throwers, and with Kai Lao helping you set up siege ram blitzes, you should be able to zip into your enemy's base and take out critical infrastructure during key moments in the game, relying on your infantry frontline to keep them occupied, even if you are consistently losing to your enemy's arbalesters and siege onagers. This raiding playstyle is pretty much the only way you can win until you hit a post-Imperial grind-out scenario, which will often see the Polynesians in a very good position. As with other civilizations I have designed in the past, your huge eco compensates you for your lack of power as the Polynesians, and as such, you really need to be devoting more micro-resources to your economy as them than you would as other civilizations. Making sure that your weirs are producing properly, making sure your villagers aren't mining out all the stone. It's going to be a very different late game than you are used to, but if you can master it, you have tons of endurance, and that means a lot in post-Imperial Age. Playstyle over. Wow, this video is long. Let's move on to the loose threads, starting with some uncertainties, things that I'm still not quite sure of even after finishing the build. First of all, I devoted a whole section at the beginning of the video to this, but is an Oceanian civilization too much of a stretch? Simbelmynë did a great job of convincing me that it wasn't, but then again, I tend to be the sort of person that likes pushing the boundaries in Age of Empires, so this is the one I'd be most interested in hearing your thoughts on down below. Something that I noticed while Simbelmynë and I were researching for this video is that there's really room for more than just the Polynesians in Oceania if we open the doors to that region. This civilization could easily just be called the Tongans, with the Samoans being a unique civilization, the Melanesians, who aren't Polynesian for the record, being their own civilization. There are other options for Oceania in addition to this particular civ, and I'm just not sure how much we should open the door or whether we should open it at all. When I posited this idea to Simbelmynë, he was like, maybe not, Robbie, but you know me. I always have to take these things to their logical conclusions. Another thing, the Polynesians have a very, very weird tech tree. The Meso civilizations were already a big departure for the norm, and I'd say that these guys are even more off the walls than the Meso civilizations, but Simbelmynë did a great job of kind of toning down my natural tendencies towards overcomplexity, so I think we did okay with this one. I'm less concerned about this than the first question, but even so, if you have thoughts on this, I'd love to hear them. And lastly, their economy might be too good. They have a lot of strengths, and they're very weak to archers, which is another thing Simbelmynë mentioned being worried about. But they have 3 really good economy bonuses and an economy technology. that might be too much. I don't know. A strong eco in Age of Empires can compensate for pretty much any civilization's shortcomings, so this could be the thing that makes or breaks the Civ. I'd like to hear whether you think we tackled this effectively. Let's move on to some tabled ideas. Stuff that didn't make the build, but we strongly considered. First of all, a more proper Eagle Warrior replacement at the barracks. As mentioned, Simbelmynë said that he thought they were too weak to archers, and they might still be. Second of all, fire ships getting more range and accuracy. So the fire dart throwers were often positioned on ships, and this was my way of saying, oh yeah, they're flinging fire darts from fire ship to fire ship. But I didn't want to reference that rather niche and obscure topic on more than one unit, and I liked having them as a Treb replacement, so here we are now. Another one, melee units reduce enemy rate of fire. Think of it kind of like an Obuk, but instead of ripping apart armor, it would just reduce rate of fire for the duration of the combat. This would be obviously in reference to wrestling, which was common across Polynesia, even though it was most famously done in Samoa. Very cool bonus, but I wanted to move them a little bit more away from just being infantry focused because we have too many infantry and naval civilizations, and I thought infantry and economy was a cooler combination. Another option, missing crossbowmen. Funnily enough, it was very rare that archery was used in Polynesian warfare, and as such, one of my first drafts had them stuck with archer until Simbelmynë was like, they really need more castle age options, and I was like, okay, that makes sense. So instead, while they do get crossbows, they aren't very good. I think it's a decent compromise, but I was strongly tempted. Another option, immunity to murder holes. This is, again, in reference to their raiding tactics. I think that the reduced damage from buildings is a more elegant way of doing this, because I think that this bonus would cause conniptions. It sounds so annoying. And lastly, more unique blacksmith stuff. At one point, I replaced every single infantry smith tech with something completely unique, which Simbelmynë rightly pointed out was definitely too much. If my channel had a motto, it would probably be that. Actually, there was some more stuff. Yeah, all land units could at one point swim, like the Povaitau, and gain a dodge shield while they were swimming. I thought this would be very cool. The Polynesians were famous for how good they were at swimming and the fact that almost everyone in Polynesian society knew how to swim. But again, as Simbelmynë pointed out, it's too much sauce. It's too complicated and would really skew them towards water maps even more than they already are skewed. And another one, Kai Lao at one point gave units a bonus against buildings and eco units when they disembarked instead of its current effect. This is very close to how it worked historically. Kai Lao were often performed on ships just before a raid started, but I think that the current version kind of touches upon this theming while also being more useful otherwise. And another thought was renaming the current catamaran upgrades to two slightly more specific ones. Right now they are called the War Catamaran and Drua, but instead they could be called the Kalia and the Lomipo. These were both Tongan specific, and so if the civilization was renamed to the Tongans, then this would probably be how I would do it. But War Galley, War Catamaran, it's elegance, symmetry, and the Drua is a more well-known term than Lomipo, so it seemed easier to do it in a slightly more standardized way. And lastly, a unique technology we could have used, stick charts. This originally was where we put the coastline reveal thing, as well as another mechanic that made all of your ships steadily have their speed increased when they were not being microed. And so if you task your ship across the map, it just gets faster and faster and faster and faster until it caps out, at which point it will be extremely fast until it reaches its destination point, and if you retask it, it will have to rebuild the speed again. The Catamaran also had this mechanic at one point. Is it cool? Yes, but the coastline reveal is much less useful that late in the game, and the ship speed bonus thing seemed very oppressive if you were good at using it, and I wasn't really sure how to resolve it with something like attack move. So we relegated this off to the side. I could see a speed increase like this being a feature on a future build. Yeah, Catamaran bonus at 1.2. Good presentation creation, Robbie. And at last, we come to the end of this monster of a build. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let's take a look at the likeliness. In my personal opinion, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is it that the Polynesians are added as a civilization to Age of Empires 2 in the future, maybe looking a little bit like this build here? And for the likeliness, we have a 2 out of 10. Why not a 1 out of 10, Robbie? Well, frankly, from what Simbelmynë told me, people have been wanting the Polynesians for a long time, and people have also been fiercely against the Polynesians for quite some time. When you have that sort of controversy, the devs are very likely to take notice, so I think there is a chance that they get added as oh yeah, this is the last part of the world we really haven't touched upon, let's do them. But beyond that, I don't think there's any chance. So 2 out of 10. Cool as they are, I don't think it's particularly likely. And I had no idea about the controversy surrounding them either going into this. Apparently AoE2 theory crafting is very big on Reddit, but I have never used Reddit before. And as such, a lot of the dramas surrounding it are completely new to me. But that's it. We are now at the end. How did you like this particular build? What would you have done differently? Once again, a massive thank you to Simbelmynë for all of the work that he put into this build. I could not have done this one without him. If I had come at this alone, who knows where it would have gone. So Simbelmynë, thank you so much. You're a great guy and you were great to work with. And lastly, to all of you viewers, I want to know, what do you want to see me tackle in videos in the future? And with that, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.